The fourth chapter, Persecution. Quoth the Prophet, Allah created paradise for the man who obeyeth him, even if only a black Abyssinian slave, and hell for the man rebelling against him, even if he be a nobleman of the Quraysh. Islam, tending towards the perfect equality of castes and races, naturally attracted all the poor and downtrodden of the city. With increasing vexation, the idolatrous masters saw their slaves in eager crowds converted to the new faith. But as these wretched folks were in the tyrant's power, they glutted their vengeance on them, not daring to attack disciples of the Prophet occupying higher rank. Umayyah ibn Khalaf, having become aware of the conversion of his black slave, Bilal ibn Hama, was engrossed with but a single thought, that of torturing him with the most dastardly refinements, placing his neck in a noose made from a rough rope of palm fiber. He gave him into the hands of boys, knowing no pity. They dragged him along behind them, like a beast of burden, just for amusement. The rope, pulled this way and that by the juvenile wrongdoers, plowed a sanguinary furrow in Bilal's flesh. Nevertheless, he seemed insensible to pain. Thereupon, his master deprived him of food and drink, and led him from the town at noonday in the middle of summer, throwing him out in the Ramda, a sandy plain so torrid that a slice of meat thrown on the ground cooked itself immediately. He made his slave lie down, stretched out on his back, an enormous stone on his breast. "Thou shalt stop there," he ordered, "until thou dost abjure Mohammed's doctrines, and worship Lat and Uzza." But the stoical Moslem did nothing more than lift the forefinger of his right hand, saying again and again, "Ahad, Ahad, Allah is one, Allah is one," thus testifying the scorn he felt for his master, who dared to couple wooden or stone associates with the master of the worlds. The affirmation of the slave produced insensibility to pain, because the ineffable joy of the sacrifice for his faith mingled with and mastered the bitterness of torture. Passing one day near the Ramda, Abu Bakr witnessed this cruel sight. "Fearest thou not the justice of Allah, the Most High, O Umayyah, when thou dost inflict such torment on that wretched man?" he cried indignantly. "Thou didst corrupt him. Therefore 'tis thy duty to save him," was the cynical reply. "Willingly. I possess a young black slave, stronger and a better worker than thine. Moreover, he is entirely devoted to thy idols. I offer him to thee in exchange." Umayyah accepted and turned Bilal over to Abu Bakr, who granted him his freedom straightway. Besides, this generous man, may Allah make him welcome in his grace, purchased 6 other slaves, men and women, all Islamic converts, merely to set them free, and deliver them out of the hands of their idolatrous masters. These persecutions continued notwithstanding, becoming more and more barbarous. The Banu Makhzum tribe took Ammar, with Yasser, his father, and Samay, his mother, out on the Ramda, in order to make them suffer all the tortures prompted by diabolical ferocity. Ammar was enclosed in an iron breastplate that held him down on the ground, exposed to the blazing rays of the sun at its zenith. His flesh crackled, as if in contact with molten metal. But the same thing happened as with Bilal. The idolaters were unable to drag from Ammar, or his parents, tortured in like fashion. One blasphemous word. It was then that, blinded by rage, Abu Jahal drove his spear through Samay's heart, mocking the dying woman by telling her, "If thou dost believe in Muhammad, 'tis because thou art in love with his beauty." Samay was the first martyr to Islam, but such constancy was not to be found in all. A few believers, enfeebled by privation and torture to such an extent that they could not stand upright, finished by letting fall from their lips, despite themselves, the blasphemous utterances ensuring release. For such as these, crushed by shame and shedding tears of repentance, the following surah of consolation has come down. Whoso after he hath believed in God denieth him, if he were forced to it, and if his heart remain steadfast in the faith, shall be guiltless. But whoso openeth his breast to infidelity on them in that case shall be wrath from God, and a severe punishment awaiteth them. When the prophet saw what tortures were inflicted on his disciples, and that he was powerless to protect them, he was overwhelmed with intense sadness. The martyr's courage proved to him how deeply the roots of faith were planted in their hearts. Nevertheless, he considered that such sacrifices should be avoided. So he advised all who were weak, or even such as were not forced by imperious necessity, to remain in Mecca, to emigrate to Abyssinia, a land inhabited by Christians, whose chieftain, the Najashi, Negus, was celebrated for his tolerance and justice. The emigration to Abyssinia. 16 Muslims were the first to depart. Among them was Usman ibn Affan and his wife Ruqayya, one of the Prophet's daughters. They went out from Mecca secretly and on foot. Reaching the shore of the Red Sea, they chartered a felucca, which carried them over to the opposite bank, from whence they journeyed to the court of the Najashi, who welcomed them kindly. Another caravan soon joined them, and the little Mussulman colony, having taken refuge in Abyssinian territory, was made up of 83 men and 18 women, exasperated at seeing their victims escape from their clutches, and still more furious to have to include among the emigrants members of their own families, such as Habibah, daughter of Abu Sufyan. The idolaters dispatched to the Najashi 2 ambassadors, Umar ibn al-As and Abdullah, son of Abu Rabi'a, bearing rich presents, with a view to claiming the fugitives, described as being dangerous agitators, capable of causing a revolution in his kingdom. The Najashi had already seen that the contrary was the case. By their honesty and virtue, the fugitives had gained the esteem and sympathy of his subjects, so that he did not feel inclined to favor the request of the ambassadors, despite their valuable gifts. They then thought it would be as well to touch upon the religious susceptibilities of the Christian monarch, and put him on his guard against the danger of Islam. Know then what these impostors seek to attain, said they to him. They have set foot in thine empire in order to turn thy subjects away from the religion of Jesus, even as they sought to lead the Quraysh astray from the religion of their ancestors. Shouldst thou wish to put our veracity to the test, question them concerning their opinions with regard to Jesus, thy God. The Najashi followed this piece of advice. He interrogated the most learned among the emigrants, and elicited the following reply from Jafar, Muhammad's cousin, son of Abu Talib. These are the verses revealed to the Prophet. The Messiah, Isa, Jesus, son of Maryam, Mary, is only an apostle of Allah, and his word which he conveyed into Maryam. This answer was not at all displeasing to the Najashi. If it did not acknowledge the divinity of Jesus, it showed, at least, the deep veneration in which he was held by the Moslems, and the Abyssinian monarch was fully reassured as to the fugitives' intentions. So he sent the ambassadors away, without accepting any of their presents, or giving them the slightest satisfaction. The conversion of Umar, son of Al-Khattab. The unbelievers had succeeded in making fierce Umar think that he would save his country by ridding it of Muhammad. So Umar, having buckled on his sword, and his eyes flashing fire, bent his steps in the direction of the Safa district, where he fancied he might fall across the Prophet. Umar, on his way, met Naim, who had gone over to Islam unbeknown to his fellow tribesmen. "Whither goest thou, O Umar?" queried the convert. "To seek out this fellow Mohammed who hath stirred up strife in the midst of the Quraysh. Oh, by our gods, I must kill him." "By Allah, thy soul leadeth thee to do a mad act, O Umar. Dost thou think that the Abdi Manaf will leave thee in peace on the face of the earth? If thou dost put to death their relative, Mohammed," he added, trying to deter him from carrying out his abominable plan, "would it not be far better to get certain members of thine own household to explain their doings?" "Who are these persons under my roof?" "Thy sister Fatima and thy brother-in-law," said Ibn Zayd. "They too are Moslems." At these words Umar stopped dead, the direction of his fury changing, and in great haste he hurried to the dwelling of Fatima, his sister. Just as he got there, Khubab, a fervent disciple, was reading the Surah Taha, written out on a piece of parchment. At the sound of Umar's furious knocking, Khubab fled into an adjoining room, and Fatima hid the parchment in the folds of her attire. But Khubab's voice had been overheard by Umar, who asked in imperative accents, "What is this recitation in an undertone that I heard, and which ye cut short when I arrived? There was nothing to hear." "Thou art mistaken," his brother-in-law and sister protested in chorus. "No, no, there is no mistake. Neither do I err when I tell you I have learnt that ye follow Muhammad's religion." Without waiting for any further explanation, he rushed at his brother-in-law, knocked him down, sat on his chest, and seized him by the beard. Fatima threw herself on her brother and made desperate efforts to free her husband. "Thou speakest the truth. We are Moslems." Umar lost his wits at this confession, and by a brutal blow in the face, he dashed courageous Fatima to the ground. "Yea, we are Moslems, O enemy of Allah," she repeated, staring boldly at him, her blood flowing freely. "Yea, we believe in Allah and His Prophet. Now do with us as thou wilt." When Umar saw his sister's blood, the indomitable courage of the weak woman impressed him greatly, and he was ashamed of what he had done. "Give me the parchment that I heard you reading," he asked his sister in softer accents. "I wish to get some idea of that which hath been revealed to Mohammed." "We fear thou mayest destroy the writing. Be not afraid. By Allah, ye shall have it back so soon as I shall have read it." Despite her wish to try and convert her brother, Fatima raised objections. "O my brother, I cannot confide it to thee, for thou art unclean. Only pure hands are allowed to touch the book in which are inscribed the words of Allah." Umar rose with docility and performed his ablutions. Then did Fatima hand over the parchment on which was written the Surah Taha, which begins with these words, "Not to sadden thee have we sent down this Quran to thee, but as a warning for him who feareth." Immediately after the reading of the first verses, Umar, who was remarkably well learnt, could not refrain from uttering a cry of admiration. "How beautiful! What sublime language, O Umar!" exclaimed Khubab, coming out of his hiding-place. "I had great hopes that the Almighty would fulfill, in thy favor, the wish I heard the Prophet make but yesterday." "O Allah," said he, "strengthen Islam by the conversion of either one or the other of those two men, Abu Jahal or Umar." "Lead me at once to Muhammad," replied Umar, "so that I may become a convert to Islam in his presence. Where is he? Sent him to the dwelling of Arkham in the Safa district. In that house, the disciples, clustering in union round the Prophet, were drinking in his words, when imperative knocks shook the door. One of the comrades rose up, and, by a crack in the wood, caught sight of the terrible warrior, his sword dangling from his belt. Thunderstruck at this apparition, he came back to warn the Prophet, who calmly told him, "Bring him in here. If he cometh with good intentions, we will grant him generous welcome, but if evil designs guide his footsteps, we will kill him with his own sword." The companions having obeyed, Umar entered. Muhammad went to meet him, and coming face to face with him in the entrance hall, he caught him by the collar, and, with a sudden pull, dragged him into the midst of the company assembled. "What is thy motive in coming here, O son of Al-Khattab?" he asked. "Dost thou still mean to remain wallowing in impiety until the wrath of the Almighty crusheth thee?" "O Prophet," answered Umar with unaccustomed humility, "I come to declare my faith in Allah, His Messenger, and His revelation." "Praise be to Allah." "Glory to Him," cried Muhammad. When his companions were informed of Umar's sudden conversion, they went their different ways, full of gratitude towards him who had decreed it. Umar was not a man to remain patient and conceal his convictions. In the street, he stopped the first passerby he met, one Jamal ibn Mamar of the Juma tribe, and said to him, "Dost know, O Jamil, that I have become a Mussulman?" The words were hardly out of his mouth, before Jamil, an incorrigible gossip, tucked his mantle tightly round him and ran to the temple. "O assembly of the Quraysh men," shouted he to the idolaters who were there in groups, "an astounding piece of news. The son of Al-Khattab hath lost his reason." "Thou liest?" interrupted Umar, who had followed him. "On the contrary, I have set out on the road to salvation. I bear witness that there is no other God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his prophet." On hearing these words, amounting to insulting aggression, the Quraysh bounded forward, as one man, to throw themselves on Umar, who steadfastly awaited their attack, and a fearful struggle took place. Darting its flaming rays on the fighters, forced them to desist for a short space of time. During the truce, Umar sat down on the ground, surrounded by his enemies whose threatening hands were stretched over his head. "Do with me as ye will," he told them in tones of the most scornful indifference, "but, by Allah, if I were only at the head of 300 Mussulmans, we should not be long before we wrested this temple from you, and never would ye be able to retake it." At this juncture, a respected old man, attired in a striped mantle and a sumptuously embroidered tunic, drew nigh, brought there by the tumult of which he asked the cause. "Umar is demented," was the answer. "How so?" said the old man to the idolaters. "If this man hath voluntarily chosen some religion different to yours, hath he not a right to do so? What want ye of him? Moreover, think ye that his relatives will not feel inclined to interfere on his behalf? Struck more by the fear of reprisals than by the wisdom of his words, Umar's assailants, clustering round him, dropped back and dispersed. It seemed as if a heavy cloak had been lifted from his shoulders. No one, except Muhammad, dared to pray in public. Umar, caring naught for the fury he might cause, made it up his mind to follow the Prophet's example, and every day the sturdy warrior turned like Muhammad in the direction of the Beit-ul-Muqaddas, the holy temple of Jerusalem, doing exactly the same as the Prophet. Umar took his stand between the angle of the Kaaba, where the black stone is enframed, and the angle looking towards the Yaman, and there publicly said his prayers. Encouraged by this audacity, numerous were the Moslems who came to pray in public by his side. Despite the angry glances of the unbelievers, only restrained by the reputation of Umar, who had earned the surname of al-Faruq, the cleaver, because he had once cleft in twain an Arab who refused to bow down to a decision given out by the Prophet. The exile of the Banu Hasham. Despite the superiority of numbers, the idol worshippers of the Quraysh were obliged to acknowledge the critical state of their party, unless they could put an end to the irresistible movement that daily brought new conversions. Their domination over the Arabs would soon become a thing of the past. They called a meeting, and, after consulting, resolved to break off all relations with the Banu Hashim and the Banu Muttalib, who were to be banished from Mecca until they consented to hand over Muhammad, their relative, in order to prevent themselves being tempted to break their word. The Quraysh leaders wrote out the conditions of this compact on a sheet of parchment which they hung up inside the Kaaba. Their plan was most cunning. Among the Banu Hashim and the Banu Muttalib were a large number of idolaters who the Quraysh thought would refuse to identify themselves with Muhammad and suffer for his cause. Therefore, strife would be stirred up in the bosom of the Prophet's family. But, contrary to the idol worshippers' conjectures, the example of Abu Talib, Muhammad's uncle, carried away all the members of his family, with the exception of irreducible Abu Lahab, actuated by feelings of unanimous solidarity. This fact enables us to divine one of the reasons that prevented Abu Talib from adopting the Islamic religion, although he worked hard and successfully, helping it to triumph. Ating make half. Zij speel helps the wine. Big triumph. He did not forget Abu Lahab's ironical remark, "Thou hast naught else to do than to obey thy son Ali, now that Muhammad hath chosen him to be his lieutenant." Abu Talib's pride caused him to dread mockery. "I would willingly become a convert to Islam," said he one day, "were it not that I feared to become the laughingstock of the men of Mecca when they would see me saying my prayers." Nevertheless, these motives would not have held him back if he had not considered that the protection he granted to his nephew, threatened on all sides, would lose all its power following the day when the uncle also should have abjured the religion of his forefathers. Directly after the proclamation of the decree of expulsion, the members of the Prophet's family, Mussulmans or idolaters, left their houses, scattered here and there, in different districts of the town, and assembled in a neighboring ravine where Abu Talib possessed a stronghold. During a period of 2 years, the exiles endured the greatest privations. Their provisions were quickly exhausted, and it was impossible to renew them. They were forbidden to show themselves in the markets, and if one among them, having succeeded in getting to follow a caravan, tried to procure a few articles of food, the dealers, watched by Abu Jahal or fearing to be denounced, asked such high prices that the luckless wight was obliged to give up all ideas of purchase and return empty-handed to his starving family. The outlaws were sometimes secretly revictualled by compassionate folks, such as Hisham ibn Umar, who had recourse to the following stratagem. At nightfall, he led a camel, laden with provisions, to the entrance of the ravine, and gave him a violent cut with a whip, in such a way that the animal bolted in the direction of the starving fugitives and was captured by them. But such a godsend was not an everyday occurrence, and Muhammad and his family were driven to feed on the leaves of the thorny bushes growing in the valley. The decree of expulsion destroyed by a worm. Meanwhile, the Prophet was apprised by a vision that, in order to destroy the impious document written by the Quraysh, Allah had sent a gnawing worm, and only the holy name had been respected. Abu Talib, hearing about this, and having faith in his nephew's vision, went with his brothers and sought out the unbelievers. They exulted on seeing him approach, his features distorted by the pangs of hunger. Conquered by famine, Was Abu Talib about to throw over his nephew? They were so sure that this was the case, that they accepted his proposals without hesitation. "Let us go and look at the parchment," he said. "If Mohammed speaketh truly, the act is abolished. Should that be, ye must swear to cancel your ruling of outlawry that oppresseth us. For my part, I swear to give Mohammed up to you if he hath lied." The act was sealed with 3 seals. Since it had been deposited in the Kaaba, it had neither been seen nor touched by anyone. Therefore, Allah's enemies thought it impossible that the Prophet's vision could be authentic, and, anticipating victory, they went to the temple with Abu Talib to see the state of the parchment. The Prophet's words had come true. In the act in question, the gnawing maggot had destroyed every unjust and impious sentence. Naught remained intact except a narrow strip of parchment on which could be read these words: "In thy name, Allah." This verification plunged the idolaters into a state of unspeakable stupor. Abu Jahl was the first to leave the temple, and he tried to retract the promise given by the Quraysh. Thereupon, many among them, Hisham ibn Umar, Zohair ibn Abi Umayyah, Mutam ibn Adi, etc., whose interests and intercourse had suffered on account of the odious decree, having only signed it under duress, protested one after the other. "We supported this iniquitous law against our will. Now it no longer exists. Therefore, the impious pact set forth therein should be annulled." Abu Jahl was forced to bow down in the face of the prodigy, and these vehement protestations. Compact was cancelled. The Banu Hashim and the Banu Muttalib returned without let or hindrance to their dwellings. The death of Abu Talib and Khadijah. It seemed as if Islam was henceforward to soar aloft safely, when 2 events suddenly caused its wings to be clipped. First came the death of Abu Talib, its indefatigable protector, who had passed the age of 80. We have already mentioned that, despite all his sympathy for Islam, Abu Talib had never consented to profess it. Abu Talib, in his dying moments, having advised all present to obey Muhammad in everything, for he was sure to lead them into the path of righteousness, the Prophet risked a supreme effort. "O my uncle," said Muhammad, "thou dost soothe their souls with wise counsel. But wilt thou do nothing for thine own? What wouldst have me do? Bear witness simply that there is no Allah but Allah. I know that thou dost speak truly, but I fear to be accused of only testifying in affright at the approach of death. Were it not for this fear, be assured that I would follow thy advice, in order to freshen thine eyes in which I read the high degree of thy affection." Some writers maintain that Abbas, seeing the dying man's lips move, and having placed his ear close to them, made the following declaration to the Prophet: "Be not uneasy, O son of my brother. Thy uncle hath just uttered the words thou didst wish him to say." But the most accredited traditions refuse to accept this version. Where is the truth? Allah only knows. 3 days after this bereavement, fraught with fatal consequences, the Prophet had to put up with a still more grievous loss. Khadijah, his admirable companion, who gave herself to him when he was poor and had believed in him when he was called an impostor. Khadijah, to whom he confided all his hopes. Khadijah, the sweet consoling creature, when he was crushed by the weight of despair. Khadijah, the first female Moslem, the mother of the believers, was taken from him by the fates at the age of 65. May Allah welcome her in His grace. Khadijah's ascendancy over him was so great, and yet so tender, that while she lived, he had never been unfaithful. Never. Although he was then in the prime of life, would he consent to have other wives or concubines, as permitted by the customs of his country, in spite of being invited on all sides to do so. And never, when Khadijah was no more, did he forget her. Aisha, who later on became Muhammad's favorite spouse, was keenly jealous of the remembrance of his first wife, daily evoked by him. Never was I so jealous of any wife of the Prophet as of Khadijah. Aisha is known to have said, although I never met her, and notwithstanding that her death took place long before my marriage, but the Prophet was always talking about her, and when he slaughtered a sheep, he always kept back a liberal share to be given to Khadijah's female friends. I said to him once, "It seems as if Khadijah was the only woman in the whole world." Thereupon he began to enumerate her incomparable qualities, and declared that she would have a palace built of pearls in paradise, with no noise or household cares to trouble her. Hala bint Khuwaylid, Khadijah's sister, was taken to see Allah's messenger. He noticed that she spoke in the same way as his dead wife, and was so stirred that, overcome by jealousy, I could not help showing temper, and I exclaimed, "What meanest thou by continually conjuring up the remembrance of these old Quraysh females with their toothless, red gums and faces, betraying the ravages of age? Hath not Allah given thee better women in their stead?" But despite these scenes, despite the beauty and intelligence of Aisha and his other wives, the Prophet always preferred Khadijah. He included her among the 4 most perfect women that ever came on earth. The 3 others were Asya, Pharaoh's wife who saved Moses; Maryam, Mary, mother of Isa; Jesus; and Fatima Tuz Zahra, one of Muhammad's daughters by Khadijah. The journey to Taif. Stricken by his double mourning, threatened by the unbelievers who no longer concealed their intentions, now that his noble protector was no more, the Prophet resolved to preach outside Mecca, if he succeeded in gaining over some of the neighboring Arab peoples. These reinforcements, increasing the number of citizens of Mecca already converted, and which was far from inconsiderable, would make up a party sufficiently strong to hold his detractors in respect. His first attempt was made at Taif, a small town about 72 miles to the east of Mecca, renowned for its grapes, figs, pomegranates, and the roses of its enchanting gardens. Accompanied by Zayd ibn Haris, Prophet arrived in the marketplace, where he found many noted Saqifs assembled. He sat by their side and stated the reasons of his journey, his divine mission, and the hostility of his party. Most of those present were beginning to fall under the influence of the wonted charm of his words, when three brothers, ranking among the most noble and predominant of the Saqifs, interrupted him abruptly. "This man hath doubtless stolen or torn the veil of the Kaaba," exclaimed the first of the brothers, "and now, having taken to his heels, he tells ye a story about being Allah's messenger. Hath Allah not been able to find anyone but thee?" jeered the second. "By Allah, he'll never have anything to do with thee," declared the third. "If thou art truly the prophet of Allah, as thou dost assert, thou art so far above me that I dare not argue with thee. And if thou art merely an impostor, it would not be fitting that I belittle myself by replying." These remarks broke the charm, and the crowd, veering round, showed its hostility by shouting insults. Prophet saw that there was no hope for him in that town for the moment, and rose up to depart, so as to make it impossible for him to renew his attempt. His contradictors stirred up the lowest dregs of the populace against him. Slaves and vagabonds, arrayed in a double row, awaited him on each side of the road he was bound to take. They found amusement in stoning his bare legs. When exhausted by his sufferings, he sat down in the middle of the road, trying to shield his bleeding feet. His tormentors lifted him up by the arms and continued their barbarous fun. In vain, devoted Zayd tried to protect him by getting in front of him. The faithful henchman was struck down by a stone that cut his face. Staggering, falling, rising, and dragging themselves along in the midst of sneering jibes, Mohammed and his companion at last reached a garden wall, behind which they took refuge, and dropped extenuated in the shade of a tree covered with vine branches, leaves, and grapes. "O Allah," cried the Prophet, "to Thee I complain of my puny strength, and the failure of my zeal with regard to these men. O Thou, most compassionate and merciful, Thou art the Lord of the weak, and Thou art my Lord. I have none but Thee, on whom to lean. But if Thou be not angry with me, because I am powerless to ensure love and respect for Thy word, I care nothing for all the ordeals I undergo." The villainous mob did not dare to trespass in the garden, in order to follow up their victims. The owners of the property, charitable folks, indignant at the scene they had just witnessed, ordered Addis, their gardener, to gather bunches of grapes and carry a basketful to their momentary guests. When the inflammation of their limbs, covered with bruises, had subsided by reason of repose in the beneficial shade, and their thirst being quenched by the honeyed juice of the celebrated grapes of Taif, the Prophet and his companion set out again on the road to Mecca, foreseeing the welcome in store for him. Muhammad could not do otherwise than claim the assistance of some influential citizen. Halting at the cave of Mount Hira, he sent Zayd to find a protector. After 2 rebuffs at the hands of Al-Aqnas and Sohail, who excused themselves, Zayd approached Mutam bin Adi, who, consenting to take the responsibility on himself, armed his serving men and posted them in the precincts of the Kaaba. Brought back by Zayd, Muhammad was then enabled, thanks to the escort of this little army, to make the 7 ritual circuits before returning to his dwelling. The nocturnal journey and ascension. Al-Isra, the nocturnal journey, and Al-Miraj, the Prophet's ascension, have given rise to innumerable debates between the doctors of Islam. Some think that this miraculous journey was really physically accomplished, whilst others, relying on the most accredited traditions, among which is that of Aisha, Abu Bakr's daughter and Muhammad's favorite wife, maintain that Muhammad's soul alone undertook the journey, and that it should only be looked upon as a veracious vision, such as frequently came to the Prophet in his sleep. One night, the 27th of the month of Rabi-ul-Awwal, the angel Jibril, upon whom devolved the duty of directing the heavenly bodies, was ordered by the Almighty to increase the moon's brilliancy by adding a part of the sun's radiance, and that of the stars by a share of the moon's brightness, so that the firmament that night should be resplendent with light. The angel was then to descend to where Muhammad was sleeping, and carry him up to Allah through the 7 zones of heaven. Quoth the Prophet, "I was in a deep sleep when Jibril appeared to me, bringing al-Burak, the Prophet's usual mount. This animal resembled none to be found on earth. His size was greater than that of an ass, less than that of a mule. His coat was more dazzlingly white than snow. He had the face of a man, but was dumb. Great wings, like those of a bird, allowed him to rise in the air and career through space. His mane, tail, feathers, and breastpiece were studded with priceless precious stones that sparkled like myriads of stars. I got on his back, and, in a twinkling, he carried me from the Masjidul Haram to the Masjidul Aqsa, i.e., the sacred Makan, temple, to the faraway temple of Jerusalem. I alighted and fastened his bridle to the ring used by the prophets. A man appeared in front of me, offering a cup of milk and a cup of wine. I drank the milk and refused the wine. Jibreel, who had accompanied me without outstripping me, or allowing me to outrun him, approved what I had done. If thou hadst preferred wine to milk, he told me, thy people would have preferred error to truth. After visiting the temple, Prophet climbed up the Sakra, the sacred rock, on which now stands the marvelous dome of the Mosque of Umar, which bowed down in his honor and also so as to enable him to remount al-Burak. Still, led by his celestial guide, he continued his journey by ascending through the heavens. We need not copy the descriptions of this ascension or mirage in every detail. Many writers, particularly the Persians, have given a free rein to their imagination in this connection, whilst others, more serious, such as Ibn Hisham, Ibn Sa'd, and Abu Fida, are content to set forth an extremely simple narrative. We shall only mention Muhammad's meeting with the prophets known before him, Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. Then his visit to the paradise of believers, where the gardens honored him by giving out sweet odors, and his halt in hell, destined to receive unbelievers, where the flames congealed when he went along. After having passed through the 7 zones of the heavens, it was not long before he heard the scratching of pens writing in the book of fate, and the thanksgivings of the angels glorifying the Almighty. Finally, he reached the Sidratul Muntaha, the low tree of the extremity. At this spot, Jibreel left him, saying, "Here is the boundary of knowledge where I am forced to halt. As for thee, O Prince of Messengers, O friend of the Master of the Worlds, continue thy glorious ascension and progress in the light of thy lights." And the Chosen One continued to pass through the veils covering that which is hidden, until he reached the veil of unity, and looked upon that which eyes cannot see, nor minds imagine. The eyes of his body would not have been able to support the brilliancy of this sight, which must have brought on blindness. Therefore, Allah opened the eyes of Muhammad's heart, thus permitting him to contemplate the infinite splendor. Allah bade him draw near to his throne at the distance of 2 bows, or even closer, and after having confirmed the choice he had made in charging Muhammad to be the carrier of good tidings to his servants, he fixed the number of prayers 50, in all that each believer should offer up daily to the Creator, in gratitude for his bounty. When the Chosen One went down, Moses met him again and questioned him, "O Prophet of Allah, what hath our Master ordered thee with regard to the number of prayers which his disciples should offer up?" 50 prayers during the day and the night. "O thou, the best of created beings," Moses rejoined, "go back to our Master and beg him to lighten this burden, too heavy for the weakness and laziness of mankind." So Muhammad went back several times into the presence of the Master of the Worlds, until he prevailed upon him to reduce the number of prayers to 5 only. This parable, which serves to decide definitively the number of daily prayers, also demonstrates admirably that an excess of devotion in the Islamic creed is considered to be an error. Allah desireth to make your burden light to you, for man hath been created weak. The Quran, 5 32. Why should the Almighty be in need of the prayers of mankind? We ask not of thee to make provision for thyself. We will provide for thee. Allah has sent prayer to his servants as one of his most salutary favors. 5 times daily, devotion brings absolute rest to believers, that is to say, complete interruption of the feelings that stir them, whether an excess of joy leading to ruin in the aberrations of debauchery, or an excess of sadness causing them to perish in the madness of despair. 5 times daily, prayer forces them, by its accompanying ablutions, to call to mind the cleanliness of the body, at the same time as the purity of the soul. The day after his vision, the Prophet, beaming with delight, was met by his mortal enemy, Abu Jahal, who addressed him ironically, "O Mohammed, hast thou not one of those marvelous tales which we are used to hear from thee to tell us this morning?" "Indeed I have," replied the Prophet. "Between yesternight and this morning I have been to Jerusalem and back. Gather round quickly, O Quraysh, hasten and hearken to the wonderful adventure of the nocturnal journey undertaken by Mohammed," shouted Abu Jahal. The crowd soon grew, and the Prophet gave out the narrative we have just set forth. Most of his hearers, belonging to the clan of the idol worshippers, followed the example of their chieftain, and received it with outbursts of the coarsest merriment. Some clapped their hands, others held their heads in their hands as if to stop their brains from bursting. As for the believers, one party was undecided whether to put faith in the story or not, and the remainder, unsettled by the attitude of the public, dared not manifest their confidence openly. Profiting by the confusion, Abu Jahal hastened to speak to Abu Bakr, that, "Maybe thou dost not know the last extraordinary adventure of thy prophet. He pretends to have accomplished, in the night, the journey from the holy temple of Mecca to the faraway temple of Jerusalem, there and back." Abu Jahal was full of glee, in anticipation, at the thought of the vexation and bewilderment which were sure to be seen in the face of his fellow citizen. Contrary to Abu Jahal's expectations, however, Abu Bakr replied without uneasiness, "Whatever Muhammad asserts is true, and I believe it. If he maintains that he went up to the seventh heaven in an hour, and came back in the same space of time, I should still have faith in his declarations." Such dependable testimony caused the faithful to take heart. Thus it turned out that Abu Jahal, by trying to instill incredulity in men's minds, only succeeded in strengthening their beliefs. Desirous of catching the Prophet red-handed as a cheat, Abu Jahal interrogated him concerning the Temple of Jerusalem, calling on him for a description thereof. But he was utterly routed when Mohammed, whom his foe thought had never set foot in Jerusalem, except during this nocturnal vision, described the city in all its peculiarities, and with great accuracy, endorsed by all among those assembled who had ever undertaken that journey. Therefore the believers, their faith revived, hastened to put on the 5 garments of purity, which means that they offered up the 5 prayers brought down to them from heaven by the Prophet. How 6 inhabitants of Yasrib were converted. Towards the end of the year, Usman ibn Affan and his wife Ruqayya returned from Abyssinia, accompanied by a few emigrants, among whom one of them, called Sukran, died on arrival. The Prophet married his widow, Sauda, daughter of Zoma, thus rewarding the zeal of one of the first female converts to Islam, who had so valiantly undergone the ordeals of persecution and exile, wishing in the same way to show his appreciation of the unchanging devotion of Abu Bakr, the veracious, and to bind him still closer by a matrimonial alliance. The Prophet, at the same epoch, espoused his daughter Aisha, although she had barely reached the age of 10. But, in her case, marriage was not consummated until many years later, at Al-Madinah, after the Hijrah. Despite Abu Bakr's energetic affirmations, despite the strengthening of the believers' zeal by the rule of the 5 prayers, the story of the nocturnal ascension was far from being advantageous to the cause of Islam. The narrative, on the contrary, furnished its enemies with an opportunity of petty triumph, enabling them to pile up fresh mockery and institute greater persecution. The case would have seemed hopeless to any other but Mohammed. Daarbij beest de koks en af. He knew not what it meant to be discouraged. Feeling certain that the Almighty would never abandon his apostle, to whom he had revealed the following verses. Say, I betake me for refuge to the Lord of men, the King of men, Allah of men, against the mischief of the stealthily withdrawing whisperer, Satan, who hides himself at the name of Allah, who whispereth in man's breast against jinn and men, postponing for the time being the conversion of the Makkans. The Prophet turned his attention towards Arab strangers in the town, attracted in great crowds by the ceremonies of the pilgrimage to the Kaaba and the ritual circuits. During the fair that was held at that time, he went untiringly from group to group, but, just as indefatigable, close behind was his uncle, Abu Lahab, who, as soon as he saw the Prophet in the center of a ring of men, would call out loudly to them, Hearken not to that man. His sole thought is to tear the cult of Lat and Uzza from out of your hearts, and trick ye all with the insane doctrines that he pretends it is his mission to preach. These words aroused the Arabs' suspicions, and they turned away from Muhammad with remarks after this fashion. Thy fellow citizens know thee better than we, so begin by convincing them. Or else, if Allah should cause thee to triumph, thy glory will not profit us, but only thy party. Therefore, it is not to our advantage to ally ourselves to thee. These rebuffs had no effect on the Prophet. No sooner did any noteworthy person arrive in Mecca than Muhammad sought his presence at once. One day, on the hill of Aqaba, he went up to a group of 6 men, fresh arrivals, and with his usual politeness he addressed them thus. What are you, O my good lords? We are of the Khazraj tribe, masters over the Jews settled in Yasrib. Methinks we are indeed their masters. Will ye not sit down here a while, so that I may speak with you? Willingly. They sat by his side, and he tried to gather them into the fold of Islam by reciting verses of the Quran. Charmed by his eloquence and the novelty of his words, the Khazraj men listened attentively, and paused to reflect. The Jews, inhabiting their land and bent beneath their yoke, were folks well versed in the knowledge of Holy Writ. Thus it was that whenever disagreement arose between them and their masters, these children of Israel were wont to murmur, We await the coming of a prophet. When his hour arrives, we shall all follow him, and thanks to his assistance, we shall triumph over you and become your masters in our turn. Whilst Muhammad spoke unto the tribesmen, they exchanged glances, and came to this conclusion. Evidently, this is the prophet whose advent is threatened by the Jews. We must not let them forestall us with him. So they replied to his appeal, saying, Our land is made desolate by perpetual war waged between us and our Arab brothers, the Aus tribe. We will go to them and call their attention to thy cause and thy religion. If through thee Allah should reconcile and unite us, there will not be in all Arabia a man more powerful than thee. The 2 oaths of the Aqaba. The new converts kept their word, and spread Muhammad's doctrines in their region. The following year, 12 Mussulmans from Yasrib, 10 being of the Khazraj, and 2 belonging to the Aus, arrived in Mecca for the Mozam rejoicings. They met the Prophet on the Aqaba and took an oath of fidelity towards him. With a view to completing their religious education and making fresh converts, Muhammad delegated Musab ibn Amr, one of his most learned disciples, who went away with them. In Yasrib, the Islamic creed did not meet with the difficulties that hampered its progress in Mecca, where it was harmful to the interests of the exploiters of the idols. Musab's task turned out to be particularly easy, and the permanent miracle of the surahs of the Quran, recited by him, produced its effect with lightning-like rapidity, resembling a beneficial rainstorm, which might have broke in a few minutes, over every part of a country suffering from drought, restoring life and fertility. Islam had diffused its wholesome dew over every district of the town, calming dissensions and causing the virtues necessary for its triumph to take root and flourish in the citizens' hearts. Soon there was not a single family among the Aus or the Khazraj which did not count several believers among its members. Mohammad, who had good reasons to be proud of the result of his mission, returned to Mecca to report progress to Muhammad. When the date of the pilgrimage came due, 75 Muslims, 2 being women, joined the caravan of their fellow citizens who were still idolaters. The converts, full of zeal, arranged to meet the Prophet on the Aqaba during the night preceding the second day of Tashriq, in order to offer a safe place of refuge in their city for him and his disciples. Ka'b ibn Malik, one of the pilgrims, has said, "We made up our minds to keep our movement secret from our idolatrous fellow citizens, among whom we slept until 1/3 of the night was past. We then went out, one after another, stealthily, making our way, slowly and silently, towards a pass on the slopes of the Aqaba, where we all met together to await the Prophet. He soon arrived, accompanied by his uncle Abbasib Abdul Muttalib. He had not yet abjured the religion of his ancestors, but he had great affection for his nephew, from whom he wished to ward off all misfortune, following the example of his brother, Abu Talib. Having been informed of the plans of the people of Yasrib, Abbas wanted to see for himself what amount of confidence Muhammad could have in their proposals. Abbas was the first to address the meeting and spoke as follows: "O assembly of the Khazraj and the Aus, my brother's son, as ye know, holds high rank among us, and although we do not share his convictions, we have hitherto protected him against his fellow citizens. In our Qawm he finds honor and safety. Nevertheless, at the present hour he turns towards you, and desires to settle in your midst. Reflect. If ye decide to remain faithful to your promises, and shield him from all dangers whatsoever, it will be well. But should ye fear to be forced one day to throw him over, and give him into the hands of his enemies, it would be better, now at once, to confess that your purpose is not steadfast by withdrawing your proposals, and leaving him with his own party." Without the slightest hesitation, we answered Abbas, "Thou hast heard what we proposed. Thou canst rely on us absolutely." Then we turned to Muhammad. "Speak, O Prophet, what dost thou want of us, for thy Lord and for thyself?" After having recited a few surahs and recapitulated the fundamental principles of Islam, the Prophet added, "Swear that ye will fight to defend me and my disciples, as ye would fight to defend your wives and children." We took the required oath with unanimous enthusiasm. "By Allah, we are war children, and our fathers have taught us how to manufacture all weapons." "O Prophet," broke in Abu Hashim, "there exists a compact between the Jews of Yasrib and us, which we shall have to break perhaps, in order to uphold thy cause. What would be our position in our land if, after being victorious thanks to us, thou didst go back to thy Qawm?" The Prophet smiled and protested, "Rest easy on that score. Your blood hath become my blood, and your honor my honor. He who wrongeth you wrongeth me. Ill fight the enemies you fight, and support whom ye support. Ye are mine, and I am yours. Choose then 12 Najibs among you as leaders." After having consulted together, we chose 9 Khazraj and 3 Aus. When we brought the 12 men to him, he said, "Ye shall be my delegates in your Qawm, as were the apostles of Jesus, son of Mary, among their people." The Najibs pledged their words. But just as the solemn oath was about to be sworn, Ibn Ubadah rose and said, "O assembly of the Khazraj and Aus, have ye reflected seriously anent the consequences of the compact ye intend to make with this man. For his sake ye swear to go to war with white, swarthy, and black men. But if, in days to come, seeing your property pillaged and your nobles massacred, ye were to forsake him, shame would be brought upon you in this world and the next. And the next we are resigned in anticipation to the loss of our property and to the death of our best men. If such a sacrifice is useful for the cause of Islam, we replied unhesitatingly, but may we ask the Prophet what we shall receive in exchange? He replied, Paradise, who, from desire to behold the face of their Lord, are constant amid trials, and observe prayer, and give alms in secret and openly out of what we have bestowed upon them, and turn aside evil by good. For these is the recompense of the abode gardens of Eden, into which they shall enter together with the just of their fathers, and their wives, and their descendants, and the angels shall go in unto them at every portal. Peace be upon you, say they, because ye have patiently endured. And charming is the recompense of the abode. So oft as they are fed therefrom with fruit for sustenance, they shall say, This same was our sustenance of eld. But they will only resemble those of earth, being infinitely more delicious. And theirs shall be the hours with large black eyes, like close-kept pearls. No vain discourse shall they hear therein, nor charge of sin. We will remove whatever rancor was in their hearts. And they shall say, Praise be to Allah, who hath guided us hither, and other things which ye desire will he bestow. Help from Allah and greedy conquest. O ye who believe, be Ansars of Allah. When they heard these promises of inconceivable bliss in paradise, announced by such tokens as are understood by mortals' weak brains, the faithful felt their souls filled with hope, and said to the Prophet, Stretch out thine hand. Muhammad offered his hand, opened out, the palm turned upwards, and Asad ibn Zurara came and struck it with his right hand, followed by Abul Hisham and Al-Bara, and, one after the other, all the Yasrib pilgrims, who, from that day forth, called themselves Ansars. We were getting ready to return furtively to our encampment, our hearts brimming over with joy and hope, when, in the silence of the night, on the summit of the Aqaba, a voice resounded, the most shrill I had ever heard. O assembly of the Quraysh, it shouted, be on your guard. The sons of the Khazraj and Aus have sworn to fall upon you with the sword. We shuddered, but the Prophet removed our fears by saying, That is the voice of the demon of the Aqaba, which means that Iblis, Satan, is shrieking. He is Allah's enemy, and his cry has not been heard by any of our adversaries. We returned to our tents, where we found our fellow citizens sleeping soundly, suspecting naught of that which had taken place. Nevertheless, upon awaking next day, a deputation of Quraysh nobles arrived, warned either by the voice of Iblis or by reports of spies dogging the Prophet's footsteps. O assembly of the Khazraj and Aus, said these delegates, it hath come to our ears that ye have allured one of our men, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, and taken an oath with him to wage war upon us. The idolaters of our party, knowing nothing about the events of the night, swore with most evident sincerity that the Quraysh were mistaken. This business is improbable, exclaimed one of their chieftains, Abu Salu by name. My calm would not have hidden it from me, and I have heard naught about it. Quraysh tribesmen went away, more or less tranquilized, but they met on their road some Bedouins who had been witnesses of the strange gathering in the Aqaba ravine, and who imparted their suspicions. The Quraysh convinced of the treachery of the Khazraj and the Aus, turned back in great haste to the encampment. But the tents were struck. The birds had flown and were far off by that time, out of danger. The plot against the Prophet. Henceforward the Prophet could reckon on safety and shelter in the town of Yasrib, and he gave orders to all his disciples to take refuge within its walls. The idolaters could not help feeling great apprehension by reason of their victims meeting with the inhabitants of a rival city. The worshippers of images impeded the union by means of great violence, and it was only one by one, or in small, successive groups, that the believers were able to reach their place of safety. From that day onwards, they took the name of Muhajirun, or emigrants. As for the Prophet, relieved of all anxiety concerning them, he stopped in Mecca with Ali and Abu Bakr only. They knew full well the risk they ran. But, despite Abu Bakr's adjurations, Muhammad wished to make a supreme effort and resort to force before leaving his native town. He still hoped to rescue some of his fellow countrymen from idolatry, especially as he now had a shelter to offer them, and besides, he did not like to leave his post without authorization from the Lord. The emigration of the believers carried the fury of the Quraysh idolaters to the highest pitch, as well as causing them great anxiety. They resolved to strike a decisive blow. They called a meeting in the Dar an-Nadwa, House of Council, built by their ancestor, Qusay ibn Kilab. The most important resolutions were taken in this Dar an-Nadwa, where only the descendants of Qusay were admitted, but not until they had reached the age of 40, just as representatives of every division of the Quraysh were entering the House of Council. A tall, old man of haughty bearing, attired in woolen garments, appeared on the threshold. In reply to questions as to who he was and what he wanted, he replied, "I am a sheikh of the Najd. Attracted by your noble gait and the sweetness of your favorite scents, I feel great desire to hear you speak. If ye consent to admit me to your noble assembly, perchance my advice may not be entirely useless." The inhabitants of the Najd lived too far away to be suspected of acting in complicity with Muhammad. Therefore, the committee of the elders found that nothing prevented them from authorizing the noble stranger to be present during the meeting, and he followed them into the hall of debate. The head committee started the discussion at once. "We all know," they said to each other, "about the intrigues of this man Muhammad and the danger with which he threatens our country. We will talk over the best means of defense. Let each of us give his opinion freely." The first to speak was Abu Bakhtari, who made this proposal: "Let us cast our enemy into a dungeon, load him with chains, and bolt the door upon him until he die. Such a proceeding would be fraught with fatal consequences. The Sheikh of the Najd objected. If you carry it out, the news of your act of violence would filter through the prison gates and reach the ears of Muhammad's companions, who, ye may be sure, would quickly attack you in order to free him. Thanks to assistance of the Yasrib Mussulmans, they would be victorious. Let us hear someone else's proposition." Asad ibn Rabi'a rose and said, "Why cannot we expulse him from among us, and banish him from our country? When he is gone, little we reck where he taketh refuge, or what becometh of him. We shall be well rid of him." "Truly, a fine piece of advice," exclaimed the Sheikh of the Najd. "Know ye nothing about the beauty of your adversary's speech, the charm of his voice, and the strength of his arguments? Scarcely will he have set foot among the neighboring Arab tribes when he will dominate them by his eloquence, cause them to follow in his wake, and come back from exile at their head to have his own way with you all. Try and find a more reasonable plan to crush him." Then it was the turn of Abu Jahal. "By our gods," said he, "I have a project which, I am certain, will satisfy you entirely. Speak." "What is thy plan?" exclaimed his audience. "This is it. In each subdivision of our tribe, well choose a young, vigorous warrior belonging to a family equally noble and respected, and well place in his hand a well-sharpened sword. These young warriors, banded together, shall throw themselves on Mohammed at the same instant, all striking him at once. By acting in this way, the responsibility of shedding his blood will be shared among all the subdivisions to which the murderers belong, and the Abd Manaf, relatives of the dead man, unable to declare war upon every subdivision of our tribe, will be obliged to content themselves with receiving the daya, blood ransom, that we may be good enough to offer." "These are words of intelligence," exclaimed the Shaykh of the Najd, who was no other than Iblis, Satan, disguised in human shape. "That man's motion points to the only way out of your difficulty." This perfidious counsel met with the unanimous approval of the assembly. The unbelievers flattered themselves that their enemy was already got rid of, but they had reckoned without the will of the Almighty. The angel Jibril, sent by him, warned the Prophet of the conspiracy to take his life, and brought him orders to emigrate in his turn, at the same time warning him as follows: "Sleep not this night upon thy wonted couch." In Mohammed's house were several sums of money deposited with him by unbelievers, and he did not care to go away before having given back what was due to each rightful owner. He charged his faithful Ali to carry this out, after having told him what he had just heard, and saying, "Sleep in my stead on my habitual couch, and wrap thyself in this my green mantle of the Hazramot. Fear naught, no harm can come to thee from my enemies." When the first 4 hours of the night had gone by, the conspirators, among whom was Abu Jahal, who had come to excite their zeal, were posted in ambush close to the door of the house, to prevent Mohammed from escaping. They did not wish to consummate their crime in darkness, for people might then have denied the participation of the Quraysh. They preferred to await daybreak, so that it might be plainly visible that each and every one had an equal share in the murder. But he who never sleeps watched over his prophet, surrounded by foes. Verily, on their necks we have placed chains which reach the chin, and forced up are their heads. And before them have we set a barrier, and behind them a barrier, and we have shrouded them in a veil, so that they shall not see. Confiding in the protection of his Lord, Mohammed crept quietly out of his dwelling, picking up some loose earth, and throwing a handful or two on the head of each conspirator. He then went away. The eyes of the miscreants, beneath lids heavy with tedious waiting, and blinded by the bandage of sleep that Allah had placed thereon, saw nothing. "For whom are ye watching here?" quoth a passer-by, coming on the scene. "For Mohammed. Allah hath saved him, and he hath tricked you all. He hath just departed right under your noses, and after covering your pates with dust, he strode away gaily. Each startled man swiftly clapped his hand to his head, and, withdrawing his fingers dirty with dust, gave signs of stupefaction. But, peering through a crack in the door, they saw Ali asleep on the Prophet's couch, and wrapped in his green mantle. This sight set the villains' minds at rest, and they all stood sentinel till dawn, actuated by the same impulse. When the sun rose, they battered down the door, and with swords unsheathed, threw themselves on Ali. He sat up, facing them. They recognized him and called out, "How now? Can it be thee, O Ali? Where is thy companion?" "I know not." In their fury, at having been so finely tricked, they seized up Ali, and imprisoned him in the temple. But quickly recognizing what a grave mistake they would make by being revenged on the son of Abu Talib, they set him free.